Hi, and welcome back to Recovery His Way on the campus of the His Way Recovery Center here in Huntsville, Alabama. I'm Stuart Whiting, sitting down again with our director, Tom. Good afternoon, Tom.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, so last time we started a discussion on ethics, and I was wondering, you brought that to the table as a topic. Why has this been on your mind as something you wanted to share about?
Well, as I mentioned the last time we met, one of the things that I've been looking at is how to create a program, one that reflects good ethics in terms of how we interact with our community. But more significantly, we say that we're a Christ-centered program. So what does that really mean? Sometimes you put pictures of Jesus around, scripture verses around. How does it become Christ-centered? And I think that kind of goes to our ethic, this idea of how do we, really ethics about the guidelines about how we interact, right? And so, you have morals that are kind of one's own interpersonal interactions, what their values are that determine those interactions. And then our ethics is kind of more about how we share those rules and express those rules with each other. So I was thinking a lot about that idea in terms of, I get a lot of feedback from people at His Way who talk about, wow, I really feel Jesus here, or God's really a part of this and that kind of thing. But what is it that's happening here? What is it that's going on? What are some of the core things? And so I really wanted to kind of explore that more and become more intentional about being aware of it. Maybe God's blessed us in becoming something, but how do we become aware of that? How do we help others do the same? Whatever that looks like, how do we improve what we're doing, become more intentional?
And so last week, as an introduction, you walked us through something that you had outlined for teaching in a seminar with Akron, and probably other parts of the ways that you've taught, of that, most humans begin with this general rule of ethics, which is, I will do unto others as they have done unto me, this reactive.
Right.
And certainly Jesus and many religions call us to the golden rule, which everyone's familiar with, that we are going to do unto others as we would want them to do unto us. But really, you're driving us to, well, there's a deeper message and a story that comes out through Jesus's life that we, the gospel rule, I think you call it.
Right.
Well, we are to do unto others as Jesus, as God has done for us.
Right, exactly.
And then we want to continue to explore that over the next few weeks. So where are we going with the gospel rule?
Yeah, this idea of a gospel ethic, gospel rule, or a Christ-centered ethic, when I really reflected on that, I thought about, well, what is it's bigger than just what did Jesus say or teach, or even just what he did, but it's more about who he is. Jesus is the ethic, as I mentioned last week. The idea that really learning ethics is about how God interacts with man, and the fundamental way he interacts ultimately is in Jesus. Even the Hebrew writer said, God spoke long ago through the prophets in many ways. However, in these last days, he's spoken to us ultimately through his Son. And so Jesus is the fundamental expression of God's ethic. How am I going to interact with man? God understands everything about himself, obviously. He understands everything about man, in both in his createdness and his fallenness. And so God's intention is, how do I interact with man? And his answer is Jesus. Jesus becomes the answer to that. So Jesus then becomes kind of in the embodiment of this ethic. And when you look at the life of Jesus, it's typically, when we talk about the gospel, we kind of break it up into three separate things. And the verse I like to refer to, I know typically we say the death, burial, resurrection, but I like, I guess, coming out of Scripture here, what Peter addresses when he initially speaks for the very first time to this group of hostile Jews that had just executed Jesus about 50 days before that, on the day of Pentecost. He addresses who this Jesus is and kind of summarize the gospel. I just wanted to kind of read these three verses real quickly. It says in verse 22 of Acts 2, Men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. Next verse says, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men, referring to the crucifixion. And then the last verse says, God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. So resurrection. So as I thought about that, it seemed like the three things that kind of stood out was, one, that in the sense, first part, that Jesus was from God. 2, that he was crucified by man. And that 3, he was raised again. And so I kind of summarized the 3 kind of core ethics, 3 principles then as one kind of the Christmas ethic in the sense of the incarnation. Right. God chose to act, and he was motivated by some things. Jesus embodied certain things when God acted by coming in the form of Jesus to us. Secondly, was the crucifixion. That there's this kind of cruciform or cross ethic that exists in terms of sacrifice and those kind of things.
Yeah, something that crucifixion ethic is something that's very surprising, even in light of the Christmas ethic. In what we would expect to have happened.
Right.
Oh, God's coming to man. You expect something of that, and we celebrate that in Christmas, and we understand it's humble, but that's the Hallelujah chorus and the celebration and the angels rejoicing and wise men coming to seek Him and God's presence.
Right.
Then you get to the end of the story, and it's something very surprising, so much so that many who were on board with the Christmas ethic and God is among us and God is here is like, how can this be the end of the story?
Yeah. I mean, if you imagine the picture of the superhero coming to rescue you, and then we
love that story.
Right. And then all of a sudden he gets caught up in the problem and ends up getting killed himself.
And then we're left to look at each other and go,
what happened here, right?
And you're reminded of the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus who had clearly been following Jesus, knew the Passover moment was going to be the moment, and then we had hoped this is going to be the one.
Right,
so
right.
A new story emerges.
But then, of course, the great news is there's a celebration ethic. There's a resurrection 3 days later. And I think that, to me, as I looked at what Jesus did, who he was, it was about that. It's about the incarnation, about the Christmas ethic, about the cross, and then ultimately about the celebration, the victory, the resurrection. So as I thought about how Christian ethics works, how do we interact, how does God interact with us, and how we interact with each other, I felt like that those 3 fundamental things need to kind of be core to how that ethic operates. And so that's kind of what I wanted to kind of think about.
So we spent a few weeks investigating kind of through that tract of, and so I guess today thinking a little bit specifically about what is the Christmas ethic?
Right.
How does that
appropriately? We're about a couple weeks after Christmas here, so. But yeah, the Christmas ethic. So that's dealing with the incarnation. For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son. Right? That's the fundamental message of Christmas. And so one of the fundamental ethics, then to me, seems to be love. Love is the thing that motivates this whole thing. So I think it's the right place to start. I mean, everything really emanates from that fundamental principle of love. And I think one of the things that's a struggle in our society is it's an overused, misunderstood word, right? Love. We can love ice cream, we can love our dog, we can love our grandmother, we can have sexual relationships and call it making love. We have all these weird views of love. But I think from a biblical point of view, this agape picture that really is the embedded picture of what Jesus came to do is a love that is fundamentally committed to the benefit of the beloved. I am here to do whatever ultimately the beloved needs. And so love is really about service, it's about sacrifice, it has all those things, obviously elements in it, but it's fundamentally other-oriented. It's totally fixed on other. And so I think that's where the gospel starts. That's where Jesus' life certainly centers. And that's where our ethic has to start. How am I going to interact with you? Fundamentally, I do it because of my concern for your best interest.
And a decision I've made and a commitment I've made. The entire story of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is one of being very clear that humanity is undeserving of a relationship with God, that we've chosen to go our own way, and it's led to catastrophe and disaster, and we build human systems that hurt and enslave one another, and yet all along God is committed to a relationship with humans and committed to bringing them back. And it's, I think, maybe the central word that you can take from, the prophets and the relationship that He desires to have with Israel is my beloved, my the one that I love, the one that I want to have this pure marriage, and so coming in the form of man to make that happen, to really show humanity what humans can be as an ideal human, and that I am the one that is bringing that. That is the story of the Bible, is that God is doing everything on our behalf, even though we have turned our back on him.
Right. And that is fundamental then to how God interacts with us, love, our best interest, and how we interact with each other. Ultimately, it should be that way. I should be motivated to love you, and so I interact with you for your benefit. You interact with me for my benefit. That becomes, if you think about it, even within the marriage context, right? What if a wife her sole thought was, how can I bless my husband all the time? Mm-hmm. And the husband's thought was totally, how can I bless my wife all the time? That's, instead of thinking, what am I getting out of this? As soon as that happens, we start watching love deteriorate. We start watching love disappear.
You start keeping score.
Right.
Keeping percentages. And,
And one of the things that happens a lot at His Way is when guys come into our program from jail or from the streets, wherever they come from, one of the first things they are is defensive, because they're like, I've never interacted with a group of people that's ultimately out for themselves. And so I'm always looking for what's their angle. What's their angle here? What are they trying to? Okay, they're doing that. They're being nice to me right now, but what's the end game here? What are they trying to accomplish? And it's hard for them to grasp. I think when they start experiencing gospel is when they start realizing they have nothing in this except their concern for me.
Yeah.
That's their motivation. They're raising money, they're giving their time, they're sacrificing all these things, they're providing wonderful things for me, they're doing classes, they're teaching, they're counseling, they're doing all these things to help me get a job, all because they're fundamentally concerned for me. And in the gospel, I think, because God has fundamentally been concerned about me.
Yeah.
Because He's been concerned about me, now I'm concerned about you. And that's the motivation. But that's hard for them to grasp. And a lot of them, are suspicious. They're always looking for the angle. It's like, how much money you get out of this? How much of this? And they're always but when they really let that guard down, that's, I think, when the gospel begins to have its way, it starts beginning to make its way into their hearts, is when they recognize that there is no ulterior motive, there is no agenda. It's simply about love. It's simply about being concerned, compassionately concerned for another's well-being, period.
Yeah, and we know, we don't always have pure motives in everything we do. And so the ones that are really looking for a reason not to, to keep their guard up, they're going to find, we guys aren't perfect here. And it's like, we're not. But, hopefully there's some joy in this from our side and what we're trying to do, and that we're not trying to control and just trying to express. I think last week you described it as creating, a place where a basket that they can be in and be safe, and we help provide that environment. But then the love of Christ, the love of God, His transformative power can begin to work in a safe place. And yet, if they've never experienced that true kind of, we have a lot of ways of defining safe space today, which is maybe not exactly what we're talking about here, but when they're really a place where people just care about them because they are a child of God and they're creating the image of God, and that's good enough, and that's all it never needs to be for us to want to be there for them. Yeah, that's new. That's one thing that I didn't fully appreciate until I started, being part of this ministry 6 or 7 years ago. That a lot of the guys clearly have been in life situations where they are used to being used and to use people. And that's the way of the world. It's the way of the streets. Right. That's the general rule ethic. That's it.
That's why our society works. You don't have to be in the streets of addiction to experience that. And it's interestingly, I was teaching even this morning, Jesus teaching at the end of His Sermon on the Mount, which is, He says, choose the narrow gate. However, there's a narrow gate that leads to life, and there's a broad way that leads to destruction. And there's false prophets that are actively involved in selling that broad street. And we talked about, how do they sell it? And it's like, and what's it about? Well, typically it's about that, the effort to try to get you to do something for their benefit, right? That's ultimately, whether it's, I'm going to make money out of this, I'm going to get control or power, I'm going to do something, I'm going to gain something from this. And so the gospel ethic is that narrow road that's completely opposite, that isn't focused on that, but is focused on their well-being. And I think one of the things that even Christians need to be guarded against is, and I've been in the church 40 years now, it's easy to get involved with people for your benefit. Use the gospel for your benefit. And that's where the gospel loses being the gospel, because it becomes about how big my church can be, or how much money we can raise, or how many people we're going to convert so that we are being successful. How many churches can we create? And we end up with these selfish agendas, using the message of Christ to forward our own agendas. And that fundamentally the world has reacted negatively to that, rightly so, because that's not the good news. That's bad news. That's the same news that we're getting on the TV news.
Even the pagans do that. Would be the kind of postscript. Yeah, and when those things break, because when things are done out of pure motive, or better, good motives versus maybe selfish motive, it's not always clear, across the fence, looking from the outside. But when it breaks, what the damage that brings to the name of Christ and to that ministry is obviously it's crushing. It's the very reason that so much language in the New Testament is about guarding your heart against those things, and about responding to the love of Christ and the love of God in a way that reflects that, and not for our own selfish ambition. Otherwise, we're right back in the garden, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, saying, this is going to be good for me to go this way. I no longer need to be connected to Creator God. I'm going to go build something for myself, and it's doomed to fail. And it's just a question of what you're taking down with Him. And unfortunately, we've all experienced that and seen that in under the name of Christ. And so, being on guard against that, and for any ministry that's listening to be thoughtful among your team, and saying, why are we doing these things?
And I think it's easy. It goes back to we hear about enabling, that kind of thing, people being codependent, and codependency is about the same thing. It's when I get involved with you for my benefit. If it's saving my grandson from some bad situation because I can't sleep if I know that he's in that situation, well, then it's about my sleep, right? It's ultimately about me, and I can't feel comfortable with him being in a bad environment because it makes me feel bad. I want to rescue people because it makes me feel good about me. That's not love. It's not. I'm not saying those things aren't nice and they're pleasant.
It's motivating, but
but it's not gospel. Again, the gospel is always this self-sacrificing love, this love committed to the benefit of others, which leads to the second point, which is giving. Right? I mean, for God so loved that He gave. So one of the fundamental attributes, I think, of this Christmas ethic is it's a giving ethic. Of course, we're familiar with Christmas, right? Giving. It's always fundamental to Christmas is this idea of giving. I mean,
it's more blessed to give than receive, which it takes a while to learn that, right? That was not your experience when you were 7 years old. Right. I don't know. It's one of those things where it's like, I don't even know what I got my dad for Christmas. Is my mom, or I think one time I got him a back scratcher, because my dad, I always saw my dad struggling. He scratches, you get him the cheapest whatever chapstick or whatever, because we just care about the receiving.
Right. But yeah, I mean, one of the things, I love to interact with kids, and particularly my grandkids. I like to ask them the question that they don't expect to hear. So like on Christmas, I'll kind of say, come over and say, "Oh, wow, how's Christmas? That was great." And they want to go run and show me all the things they got. I said, "So hold on. What did you give to your mommy?" That's what I want to know. What did you give to your sister? What did you get? I don't know. But usually that if I push them, they'll go and you watch them start getting excited about the fact that they did do that when you start reprogramming their thought process. I think fundamentally it is more blessed to give than receive. God said that. And I think you and I have probably lived long enough, we can see it clearly. It's how much more of a blessing it's been to be a parent and to give to your children and watch them grow and all that kind of stuff. But so giving is fundamental to this. Jesus, right? The scriptures tell us Jesus did not come to be served, but to serve and to give His life as a ransom. So fundamentally, another part of this Christmas ethic is about giving. It's all about how am I involved in a loving way to extend my resources, my time, my financial resources, my availability to the benefit of somebody else. And so giving again becomes a core element of this. I think that's a key part of it. And then really the third one that I was thinking about is, from Philippians 2, where Paul writes there about how Jesus humbled Himself and did not consider equality with God something to be held on to, but gave Himself, humbled Himself, sacrificed Himself, ultimately to a cross. Think about the humility of going from eternity and heaven just to becoming a human being, born in a stable, is a humiliating situation. Then to go from that to have those very people then surrender yourself to their power when you're the ultimate power, and allow them to execute you, and in the most gruesome of ways, is the most humbling of humbling things, right?
Yeah, it's a story that just it has no equal, has no context. I mean, it's so hard to grasp, and maybe that's what attracts so many people when they really understand what it's all about.
And so part of this Christmas ethic then is just about humility, that everything's done again with ultimately God and others as the focal point, not ourselves. And even in that passage in Philippians, he starts with, don't consider yourself. I mean, that's where he begins, and use Jesus as the example of that.
Yeah, he's clearly dealing with some things there where people's pride and egos getting in the way, and he's like, hey, if we could be humble, as Christ was humble, you probably would be getting along a lot better.
Right, and that becomes fundamental to gospel. I mean, again, when a guy walks on this property and he sees people concerned for their benefit with no strings, when he sees that it seems to be about giving, and I mean, it's such a rewarding thing to see when, a guy comes in off the streets or out of jail with nothing, and immediately guys are running to the room saying, hey, you need a shirt, you need a pair of pants, you need this, you need that, here I got toothpaste or whatever. That kind of giving is involved. And then the kind of humility that, again says, this isn't about me. I'm a non-factor in this, is an incredibly powerful thing. I know humility is a hard thing for us to grasp, and we all will agree in our society, I think, that we applaud humility. Wow, we look at humble people, we think, wow, they're humble, that's great. I always think in my mind, Forrest Gump, the story of Forrest Gump is such a story about a person who's just ultimately self-effacing. I mean, he had no sense of self. He was
unaware of what's happening,
and he was just had this humility about him that ends up, of course, in this mythical story, putting him in all the center of all these big social change and all this kind of stuff that happens because he was just so willing to just be molded and available for those kind of situations. But and so we applaud that. And at the same time, if you watch the American story, it's always about humble beginnings that don't end up with humble endings. We'll say
rags to riches.
Yeah, right. That's the American dream, right? Which moves us the opposite direction than where the gospel came. Went from riches to rags, right? That's where the gospel went. And so this Christmas story is about riches to rags, not rags to riches. And so humility is about that same mindset, same heart. It doesn't mean that you have to become impoverished necessarily. It means that I value things, I value myself and value my things differently than I valued them in the past. They become of service to God instead of service to me.
Yeah, and it's those kinds of lives lived here that, again, among many of our staff who, have gone through recovery, it's really interesting to me to see people in recovery, our guys in recovery, and how, boy, they really embody this ethic. They are giving, they are humble, and in a way that, it's hard to see outside of this community, actually, to the degree I'm thinking, that just giving of their time and what, they maybe don't have a lot of resources, but they are very quick to give and help. And I guess maybe because they know the desperation that they're giving into at a level that maybe if you're not part of the community, you don't appreciate as well. But, I'm thinking of times when maybe, a need, kind of a need that's not in our wheelhouse. It's maybe a friend of a family or someone who's in need of something, and we need to raise some money, and it comes before the guys, and guys just want to give, and at times you want to say, you don't really have this money to give, but they want to be giving because they know the power of coming alongside in community. And it's a real blessing to see that, and a reminder that in our stability and in our affluence, how are we living this out, and how are we giving, and how are we using our time and our resources?
I mean, ultimately, it's a stewardship idea, right? That I recognize that my time, my money, all my resources are ultimately God's, that He's loaned to me, and the question that God's going to ask is, how did you use what I loaned you? It's the parable of the talents, right? And so that's kind of the question that needs to motivate my ethic, is in that humility. How do my things become God's things? And how do I use them? And if God chooses to use me to redistribute those things in a different way, that's kind of my ministry. That's my calling, whether it's my time or my resources, my finances or whatever. So, I mean, I think that fundamentally is where this Christmas ethic takes me. It starts with this idea of love. It gives, and ultimately it sacrifices. It's humble. It gives in this self-effacing, non-self-centered way. One of the things that I know I struggled with for a long time is I always kind of saw humility as kind of I always felt prideful, and so humility was about putting down my pride, about squashing my pride. So if somebody said, "Wow, you're really intelligent," not really, I'm really stupid.
Yeah.
Well, you're really generous.
You were a preacher for a long time.
Right.
Hey, that was a great sermon.
Yeah.
That's got to always be.
And then you're kind of like, no, it really wasn't. It wasn't a good sermon.
Yeah.
And it's like, and I remember a friend of mine, actually a preacher friend, had mentored me. One day we were playing tennis, and he kept telling me, good shot, about different things. I said, oh, no, not really. No. And finally he stopped and he said, come to the net here a second. And I said, yeah. He said, I keep complimenting you and you don't receive my compliment. Yeah. Why are you so prideful?
Yeah.
I'm not prideful. I'm being humble.
Right.
And I realized, no, that's not humility, because it's still, pride is really about being self-centered in a positive direction. Kind of what I was doing was thinking that humility was about being self-centered in a negative direction.
Yeah, it's a false humility.
Right.
For sure.
That the real key to humility is that I don't think about myself at all.
Yeah.
That I'm not a factor.
So it's funny you bring that kind of example up. I do a module in the communication class about kind of these typical ways that we communicate that maybe we're not really thinking about what we're doing. And that's one of them, is when you receive a compliment. And so, what do we typically do? We kind of typically, it's key for us to do. I don't know, it's typical for us to kind of, say, oh, no. Right. And, and I always think, what's that doing to the other person?
Right.
And to put yourself in their shoes. And that's what the nature of this module is, thinking about the other person. I said, so what might be a better way to respond? And pretty much everyone gets it. Just thank you, say thank you. Hey, I appreciate that. Or what I'm like singing a lot, and people will say, oh, I really thought, and I say, yeah, I really enjoy doing it. And it's true. I don't have to address anything else on that. And because it is, it's always the call. We always, I think we have doubts about ourselves and our performance and, our value, and it's easy to look for ways of propping that up, and where pride steps in and are having to secure something and people to know, and it's always going to be a struggle to remain that true humility, which only seeks to glorify God, and yet, it's worth stopping and thinking about, and how are we falling short in those areas, so that we can. And I think often a lot more about, do I remember the third person in the room? That God and Christ are in the equation, or is it just about me and this person and this interaction? Right. And that helps remind a lot of, oh yeah, okay, well, how is this glorifying God? Right. And even that, that's been abused, like you said, and been used, and to a point where you almost feel like maybe that somehow I'm being false in saying that. But come with a pure motive of wanting to glorify God, then it'll probably work out, because that's the way He works. Right. People with broken and contrite hearts, right? And that's who He's looking for. Right. Exactly. So, and that's what's the heart of the gospel, right? Is this broken contriteness. So the first thing I just wanted to emphasize with this gospel ethic, this Christ-centered ethic, is really a Christmas ethic born out of love, giving, and humble. And I think that's really a fundamental way that a Christ-centered ethic begins to be expressed. You can look more at the others. And any ministry that's a hallmark of, well, that's a really good starting point. Right. If you're embodying loving and giving and being humble along the way, then you're going to attract people. You're going to be able to serve people, because that's it's Christian ethic. It's Christ ethic, and He says, if you lift me up, people will be drawn to that. That's right. And so it is good news. For those listening who don't know Tom well, he is the master of alliteration for going back from years and years of of preaching. And so in putting together, Christmas and crucifixion and celebration, I'm looking forward to investigating more as we walk through the different the different details of the gospel ethic. And I think you've got us really thinking about some really important stuff. And I, again, appreciate that you infuse that into all levels of this ministry. And when we have staff meetings and when you speak to the community and you speak to our board, that this is always on your heart. And that's really important as our spiritual leader to remind us. We need that in our lives. So thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, thanks for sitting down, and thanks you guys for joining us again on another episode. If you have any questions or like any more information about the His Way Ministry, you can go to our website at hiswayinc.org.